we're focusing at this point on the evolution of the papacy, which, you know, if you listen to sort of church historians, they tell you, well, Jesus said to Peter, you know, you're the rock, I'm going to found my church on you. And then Peter became the bishop of Rome, and therefore all the bishops of Rome have been in charge of the church. You know, I mean, it's this very linear kind of narrative about how this was meant to be. And of course, as any historian knows, when you start to look under the surface of that, it's way more complicated. And we were talking last fall about some of the politics and some of the ways in which that position evolved. So I want to just remind you of some of those things as we move forward into how the Pope becomes the central figure in the Western Church. And everybody remember, we're talking about the Western Church right now, the Roman Catholic Church. And in case you ever wondered, you know, growing up or whatever, why is it always the Roman Catholic Church? That's to differentiate it from the churches of the East, which are going to be following Constantinople and become the Eastern Orthodox churches. And we will look at them from time to time, but in general, we'll be talking about what's happening in the West, okay? So the first thing is, when Constantine takes over the empire, and one of the things that happens is he becomes a Christian. But the other thing that he does, which really doesn't have that much to do with becoming a Christian, other than that he always wanted to found a city in his own honor. That was an ambition that lots of people in leadership had. That one of the things you could do to kind of consolidate your memory, you didn't get a presidential library, right? But if you were good, you could create a city and name it after yourself. So, for instance, you have Alexandria in Egypt, right, which Alexander the Great founded in his own honor, and it becomes a very influential place. So everybody will always remember Alexander because of Alexandria. Constantine is going to do the same thing. And he wants a place that's more central, because Rome is pretty much to the farther to the west than is convenient for an empire that's stretching, you know, the Atlantic is kind of the limit to the west, but it keeps stretching to the east. And so if he's going to found a new city, it's going to be more nearly east for convenience of administration. And so he takes this place that was originally called Byzantium, and therefore we get the Byzantine Empire. That's where that word comes from. And it's very defensible. I mean, he was astute militarily about this. It's kind of on water and it's on hills, and it's very, very difficult to attack Constantinople itself. And so he's going to take over this kind of two-bit town and rename it Constantinople and build a huge city there with his palace and his administrative offices and some churches. And one of the nice things about Byzantium from his point of view is it does not have any important existing pagan shrines. So he doesn't have to tear anything down. He doesn't have to insult anybody by taking away a pagan site of honor. He can build his new church without causing anybody problems, and that can be the main original focus in his town. So he's going to move the capital of the empire and the emperor's residence to Constantinople. And so what happens when he leaves Rome, when the whole capital city government complex leaves Rome? It creates a power vacuum in Rome. Well, who's staying in Rome? The Bishop of Rome, right? I mean, you're no longer the Bishop of Rome if you're going to go somewhere else, at least at this time. So a lot of the administrative authority that used to be exercised by the emperor and the emperor's delegated administrative people, is no longer there. So into that vacuum steps the Bishop of Rome, who's now kind of the head guy in charge. And from that place, that not only is that bishop going to become an important figure in the civil authority, the civic life of the city of Rome, but they're also going to become, since the military command is no longer located in Rome either, what the bishops are going to do is start taking on the evangelization of the pagan tribal peoples. That, it's not their job to necessarily go out and conquer them with troops, but it may be their job to bring them the gospel. And so that becomes part of something that the Bishop of Rome is now in charge of. And remember that as the church hierarchy evolves, it's going to become something somewhat different from the Christianity that the common Roman foot soldiers brought with them and the Roman colonists brought with them to these very foreign lands. So the Christianity that the soldiers leave in Britain, the Christianity that the soldiers leave in Gaul, is going to kind of evolve down a different path from what the missionaries who are sent by Rome are going to be bringing a century or 2 centuries later. Does that make sense? Everybody, what's going on in Rome there? Okay. So now you'd have to go back to thinking about our New Testament conversations and remember that there were basically 3 phases of what might have become the Christian church, right? There are the disciples who remain in Jerusalem. And for them, Christianity is all about its continuity with the Jewish tradition and the idea that the Messiah has indeed come. And we, the Jews, need to shift our idea of what the Messiah is, who that's going to be. He's not going to militarily kick the occupying Romans out. He's going to triumph over death. And that's better. You may not like that as well, but that's better. That's Jerusalem Christianity, okay? For those people, yes, you have to be a Jew in order to be a Christian. So if you want to become a Christian, you got to get circumcised. You got to adopt the Jewish dietary laws. You got to practice keeping the Sabbath. All of those commandments that are incumbent on a practicing Jew, you have to adopt if you want to be a Christian, because a Christian is a form of a Jew. So for them, there's no question about that. There's a smaller group of Jesus's immediate family and friends who leave Jerusalem and go back to Galilee. These are the folks for whom the relationship, the community that Jesus built and his teachings and commandments that he left with people from his ministry, that's what really matters. And they're going to try and create a community along those models in Galilee, in the burbs, if you will, outside of the central temple authority of Jerusalem. And they are going to disappear into obscurity, okay? But for a time, they're in competition with the Jerusalem Christians about who is really carrying forward the legacy of Jesus, right? Is it the people who think he was the Messiah and now we have to figure out how? Or is it the people who really took him seriously about his values and the ways in which community should be practiced, all right? And then you have this real outlier, crazy guy named Paul, who is going to leave the whole Jewish Jerusalem, all of that stuff behind, and go out to the Gentiles, to the people who don't think of themselves as Jews, who have either are practicing mystery religions or Roman paganism or who knows what. but he is going to teach them about this divine dying and rising Savior who can give them everlasting life. And he really doesn't care about their being Jews. So his position is, no, you don't have to be circumcised. Don't worry about it. You don't have to follow the Jewish dietary law. Nothing about what Jesus is requires you to become Jewish. All right. And so once the Jews, the temple Jews in Jerusalem and Palestine really get radicalized and decide that they are going to revolt against Rome, and that this time they're really serious about it. And they succeed for a little while, as we know from the Hanukkah story. But eventually Rome says, you know, this mosquito is getting really annoying, and let's just swat it once and for all. And so they send enough troops to just completely flatten Jerusalem and flatten the temple, and be done with these people. At that point, the Christian community in Jerusalem is scattered, just like the Jewish community in Jerusalem is scattered. And that becomes basically chapter 2 of synagogue Judaism. If we don't have a temple anymore, now we have to figure out, how do you be Jewish? How do you practice that faith when you're no longer in Jerusalem, when you no longer have the temple as a reference? Okay. And the Christians are going to go out to these other places, to Antioch, to Alexandria, to places where they had kind of established satellite communities, with their message of their version of Christianity. And in many cases, they're going to come into conflict with the Christianity that Paul has been spreading, right? Because there are two different versions of what Christianity looks like. And eventually the one that is going to triumph in the Roman Empire is going to be Paul's Christianity, right? That's the one that's going to capture the popular imagination and become the basis for the Catholic Church and Christianity as we know it today. Although the Jerusalem Christianity is going to pop up now and then, especially in North Africa. There are going to be small groups, and every now and then they're going to make trouble. But basically they don't have a coherent institution. And what's going to happen is Paul's message is going to evolve into a coherent institution. However, in Rome, which is one of the places that Paul does go, and traditionally the place where he's martyred, where he's killed, because the Roman powers that be take exception to this crazy new religion, and it's making trouble for them. So among those churches, those Gentile churches, the churches that are founded among people who were not originally Jews, the original authority is Paul, right? Paul is the one who is writing these letters. If you look at the New Testament, you know, 17 out of the 21 documents or something like that are letters allegedly from Paul. Some of them we know are not actually from Paul, but they were presented as if they were from Paul because Paul had the authority. Paul was the one who started this whole thing. Paul was the person that these nascent communities went to with their questions about how should we deal with this, that, or the other thing. And, you know, so some other teacher has come and told us, oh, no, you have to become Jewish. You have to do all these Jewish things. And then Paul writes back and says, no, you don't, you know, don't forget what I taught you, yada, yada. So there's a great deal of respect for Paul's authority. But Paul is not really centered in Rome, particularly. And in fact, all of the churches that are relate primarily to the church that he founded in Antioch, or relate primarily to the church that Constantine is going to build in Constantinople, or relate primarily to the church in Alexandria, and even including the remnant that's left in Jerusalem. all of those groups think that their churches and their teachings and their authority is just as good as Rome's, right? They have just as much right to their opinion. They have just as much to say about anything about how the church is organized as Rome does. There's nothing special about Rome as far as they're concerned, except for the fact that, of course, for the first 300 years, that's where the civil authority is. That's where the emperor is. So as this question begins to arise in the second and third and fourth generation of how do people get to be bishops, right? That's going to become a significant question, because in the New Testament, you have priests and you have deacons. Those roles are mentioned. There's some clarity about how they're supposed to be selected, what the qualifications are. But nobody in the New Testament was contemplating an enduring religious institution, right? Why not?
Because they thought that the Messiah was coming, that it was over.
The second
Right.
coming would be imminent.
Right. That Jesus was on his way back. So there was no point in investing energy in trying to create an enduring institution. All of this was temporary. All of it was makeshift. Okay. But eventually, so what would happen is that there was sort of a three-part qualification, if you will, for leadership in the institutional hierarchy of the church. One was that people, that is the members, liked to listen to you. They granted you authority, that your preaching was compelling, your pastoral presence was appreciated. The members of the church accepted that you were a leader, right? That was the first one. The second one was that it was okay with the civil authority that you were a leader. And in Rome, that meant it was okay with the emperor, right? So if the emperor didn't like the way you were doing it, if the emperor didn't feel that you were supportive to the emperor didn't feel that you were orthodox in the way that he understood orthodoxy, it was fairly easy. He could just expel you. He could exile you from the city. And that was true of the civil authorities in Antioch and in Alexandria also. You know, if the local representative of the empire didn't approve of you, it was fairly simple for them to get rid of you, which meant that you really couldn't function as a bishop. So you had to have the assent of the common people, you had to have the approval of the emperor, and then you also had to have the recognition of your fellow bishops. So if the other important bishops, if the other bishops who were powerful within your own see, within your own area, if they didn't like you, it was very hard for you to function because they wouldn't do what you told them to, and then you didn't have any authority. Or if the other major bishops didn't approve of you or thought you weren't sufficiently orthodox, that Rome and Alexandria and Jerusalem and Constantinople could get together and say, that guy in Antioch, we don't recognize him. We don't think that he is a true successor. We don't believe he's the bishop. And they often would send somebody else. We are appointing so-and-so. And they might be from far away, but they're going to send him. And so then the question was, how much trouble and disruption was the civil authority willing to put up with from these other cities in order to defend the bishop that they had, as opposed to the one that they were being sent, right? And if the members had kind of grudgingly said, well, okay, we'll let you be the bishop, but they didn't really like you, and then the other bishop sent somebody else that maybe they might like better, well, then that was, we will have a popular revolt and we will get this guy out. So it's always a three-part balance of who's going to be the bishop among those three different factors. but an appeal that the potential bishop could make, there were two things they could appeal to. One of which was, if the previous bishop, as they lay dying, or as they were about to retire to a monastery, sometimes happened, or whatever, as they were leaving office, they could say, here's so-and-so, they should be the next bishop. I recommend them. You know, they have the qualifications, they have the blessing of God. You know, this is who the next bishop should be. And if they were popular, and if the emperor or the governor was good with them, and if none of the other bishops had a big beef with them, then that would usually do it. That, you know, that was the line of least resistance, sort of, was to say, okay, fine, that guy is now the bishop. The other argument that you could make if you wanted to be the next bishop was an argument from apostolic succession. In other words, you could argue history. You could say, okay, I'm the bishop because I agree with Paul on the things that Paul taught, or I'm the bishop because I agree with Peter on the things that Peter taught, or I should be the bishop because I have the best grasp of how the church came to be what it is and what it needs at the moment. So this is how the bishop in Rome began to be less and less interested in the authority of Paul, and more trying to borrow the authority of Peter. Because as far as we know, Peter was the bishop of Jerusalem. Peter was out of the apostles, Peter was the leader of the group that stayed in Jerusalem, and wanted everybody to become Jewish. But there is evidence within the New Testament of Jesus kind of saying Peter's in charge, and that's how Peter comes to be in charge of the Jerusalem disciples. Okay, but who writes the New Testament? Who writes the New Testament are people who are supporting Paul's vision of a Gentile church, of a church that has moved way beyond its original Judaism. So the New Testament tends to present Paul as the hero and the other disciples as potential opponents or junior supporters of him, and not as the authority. But the power struggle, if you will, was between Paul and Peter. And so there's some sense that Peter and the Jerusalem Christians approve Paul's missionary efforts and send him out as someone who is subject to their authority, right? They basically say to him, okay, fine, you go preach this stuff to the Gentiles, right? We're going to stay with the real Christians here, right? And you see that also in the fact that Paul is always collecting money for the poor, right? But what happens with that money is he brings it back to Jerusalem to be distributed to the poor in Jerusalem during his lifetime, during his ministry in the second half of the first century. That doesn't last after Paul very long, but there is that argument that, okay, Paul was sort of a franchise, if you will, of Jerusalem, and he was always subject to Jerusalem's authority. So if you have authority from Paul, Paul had authority from Peter, and Peter had authority from Jesus, right? And therefore, every church that Paul founded is equal, has inherited an equal share of that authority, right? So the Bishop of Rome says, we're going to cut out the middleman here, and we're going to say, no, Peter came to Rome. Peter founded this church here just as much as the church in Jerusalem, which is kind of doesn't count anymore anyway. So we, in fact, are not the equal of all the other churches that Paul founded. we are superior to all the other churches that Paul founded because we get ours directly from Peter. And so that's what's this idea of Petrine succession, that that Peter said, that Jesus says to Peter, you're the rock, I'm going to build my church on you. What did Jesus ever say to Paul? Anybody? Nothing, right?
Nothing.
Nothing, because they never met in life. So Paul has a vision of the risen Christ in which he talks to him, but there's no historical acknowledged record of anything other than Paul's claims of Jesus ever saying anything to Paul, let alone I'm going to found my church on you. And so if you can make this case that your authority comes directly from Peter, then it is much easier to make the case that in fact you have a particular authority, a particular in that nobody else has, none of the other churches have. And that is what the Pope, the Bishop of Rome, in becoming the Pope, is going to begin to claim. For instance, in 343, Julius, who was the Bishop of Rome, made a ruling that any bishop who was deposed in the Roman see, in his area of authority, could make an appeal to the Bishop of Rome, who would then decide if he was really deposed. So this is a claim both of ecclesiastical and civic authority, because what that meant is if your Roman governor of the town that you were in that was under the authority of Rome, let's say Ravenna, for instance, or Naples or some of the other cities, if some governor got a bee in his bonnet and kicked you out, you being a bishop, you being a bishop could come to Rome and plead your case with the Bishop of Rome. And the Bishop of Rome could say, yeah, okay, you've been sleeping around and taking money and, you know, maybe you're not really qualified, and he's probably right. Or the Bishop of Rome could say, you know, you are a completely qualified bishop. Here's a letter, go back and tell them that I said that you are still the bishop. And any other religious official who thinks that they're now the bishop, you send them to me and let me deal with them. So there was a certain assumption of authority there that I get to decide these things for all the local areas that are under the authority of Rome. And particularly because once the move comes to Constantinople, Rome is kind of all by itself in the West, and the other four major sees, the other four major cities of Alexandria, Jerusalem, Antioch, and Constantinople are all in the East. So what you get now is the Bishop of Rome is kind of on his own. He does not have the same kind of oversight from the emperor that those other four cities do. And so he has some more freedom of decision. He's also on his own in terms of like defending the place. So it's not all roses, but his authority is now separated from the authority of the other four cities. Does that make sense? Everybody okay? All right. So the first Bishop of Rome to be referred to at the time contemporaneously as Pope, now in history, people look back and they'll call, for instance, Julius, they'll say Pope Julius, but Julius never called himself Pope. Julius called himself the Bishop of Rome. The first Bishop of Rome to call himself Pope was this guy Damasus. And some of you will remember we talked about his ascension to become the Bishop of Rome. It was quite the little drama because, and this is also important in the evolution of the papacy, there came to be a division of class between the priests and the deacons, the people who ran the individual churches and actually served the individual members, and people in the church hierarchy who were at some level more nearly servants of the emperor. They were more nearly public officials than they were ministers in the church. And so that group, the bishops, came to be dominated by upper class Romans, the same people who would have been in the Senate, the same people who would have been the generals in the military, the same people who would have been considered leaders, potential leaders of Roman society. Those are the ones who are going to be bishops. And of course, if you're the emperor, or the governor, or whatever, you're drawn from those ranks too. And those are the people you prefer dealing with. You don't want to deal with some upstart, unwashed, stable hand or something who just got a bug about Jesus. You want to deal with someone who was bred to be a commander, to be a leader in society. And so there were these two contenders basically for the job of bishop when the prior bishop was banished. And he was banished by Constantius II, who's a son of Constantine. So this is not very long after Constantine, right? This is 366. And Constantius was, as Constantine was, an Arian. He was not a believer in the Trinity. And Liberius, the banished pope, was a believer in the Trinity. So you can see how this works, that however Liberius got appointed, once Constantius came to power and discovered that he was a Trinitarian, he's like, okay, we're not dealing with this, you're out. So Liberius gets banished. And at that point, okay, we need a new bishop. And there was a lot of politicking, it's sort of like a nominating process, very kind of intrigue. There was a lot of intrigue about who the next pope was going to be. All of a sudden, Liberius died in the middle of that process. So he's no longer, it's no longer possible to bring him back. Right? You're not arguing about, hey, this was a wrong decision, we need to get Liberius back. And so at that point, now anybody who wants to be part of this conversation, they have to have a candidate. They have to choose a new candidate. So the other bishops, the upper class social leaders, chose Damasus. He's the guy that they want. He was the son of someone who was already in charge of a church, and he was well educated. He was all of the things that the upper class wants their leaders to be. But the lay people and the deacons favored this guy named Ursinius. They liked him better. They liked his preaching better. They thought he wasn't as high and mighty, if you will. So what happened was the upper group got together and they proclaimed that Damasus was going to be the Bishop of Rome. And the priests and the deacons got together with the members and they proclaimed that Ursinus was going to be the new Bishop of Rome. So both of these guys felt that they had been given the job according to the succession tradition as they understood it, right? And both of them had some reasonable claim that this was the case. But what happened was riots, basically insurrection. People were storming the Capitol. And the reality was that Damasus was a wealthy guy. And so he had the resources to hire basically gangs of thugs that went around and beat up the followers of Ursinus. And so there was a year basically of violence, and the new emperor Valentinian decided he'd had it with the violence and he would rather work with Ursinus anyway. So he then banished No, he would rather work with Damasus. So he banished Ursinius, which didn't totally satisfy everybody, but it kind of settled the question. And so you get Damasus, and Damasus's papacy actually runs from 366 when he's first elected, and there's kind of a year of uncertainty and unrest, but by 367 he's pretty much established as the bishop, and he doesn't die until 384. So there's almost 20 years there, and that's an unusually long time for someone to serve in that sort of the absolutely highest office in the See of Rome. So Damasus is not shy about consolidating the power of the papacy, right? And one thing that happens during his papacy, fairly late in his papacy, but the new emperor, Gratian, decides that Gratian is not going to be recognized as Pontifex Maximus, which is a word that you may associate in your mind with Pope. Pontifex Maximus is Latin for chief priest, right? So up until the time of Constantine, and even thereafter, as we see, until the time of Gratian, the Roman emperor was also the Pontifex Maximus. It's sort of like if someone were to say, okay, I'm going to be elected president, but I'm not going to take on the role of commander-in-chief. I'm going to let someone else in the military handle that. Does that make sense? It's a dual role now. We consider those to be the same people. Well, in Rome, the emperor was by definition the chief priest of the Roman civic cult. You know, their sacrifices mattered. Their honoring of the gods was part of what kept the city safe, right? Well, now that pretty much everybody in the equation is Christian, Gratian says, there's nothing about being emperor that makes me qualified to be chief priest. So I'm not going to be that anymore. That's not going to be part of the title of emperor. And so he resigns that title and that position to the Pope of Rome. That title is now going to be exercised by the Bishop of Rome, by the Pope. And that's part of why that identity of Pope is now becoming associated with the Bishop of Rome. Partly that was the emperor's doing, and partly it was Damasus's doing. Also, Gratian declares him the Bishop of Bishops. And so that reinforces his claim that all the other bishops are subject to him. Now, that is not a problem in a certain way, in that the Bishop of Rome was certainly the bishop of all the other bishops of all the other cities within the See of Rome, just as the Bishop of Constantinople was the supervising bishop over all the other bishops in that see. And the same with the Bishop of Alexandria and Bishop of Antioch. So there's a sense in which, yeah, you're the head guy for your area, and all the other people who might be called bishops in that area report to you and are under your authority. But Gratian makes it a little more complicated, because he doesn't say you're the Bishop of Bishops in Rome. He says you're the Bishop of Bishops, period. So that suggests that not only is he the superior of all the bishops that already report to him, but maybe he's also the superior of those other 4 sees, those other 4 bishops of those other towns that had originally been identified as his. Excuse me, we have a kitten playing with power. If my computer starts to fail, I'll plug it back in. Hopefully by then she'll have lost interest. So it makes it ambiguous, you know, is he just the bishop of his own bishops, or is he the bishop of all the bishops? And do the other four in some way have to acknowledge his authority, the Bishop of Rome? Now, the other four don't care that much because Rome is over there in the West where things are falling apart. And we're over here in the East, the four of us, we report to the emperor in Constantinople anyway. So we may not care that much what the Bishop of Rome thinks about all this, right? And that's still true in a certain way, that the patriarch of the Eastern Orthodox churches may or may not regard the Bishop of Rome as anything other than an equal, okay? That still to this day, there's a sense that these two guys are equal to each other in power. And that was what they thought back then too. But the Bishop of Rome was thinking of himself as being kind of in charge. And certainly in the West, that was becoming true. When Damasus comes to preside over councils, he presides over the council which finalizes both the New Testament and the Old Testament canon. You know, what is the Roman Catholic Church going to regard as in or out of the Bible? He presides over that church council. He also presides over the church council that's going to finalize or solidify the idea of the church hierarchy, that the Bishop of Rome is over the rest of the bishops, and the bishops are over the priests, and the priests are over the deacons, and the deacons are over the members. And there is that is in fact a hierarchy of authority. So one of the things that he does, for instance, is he defines a process for doing the succession, deciding the succession when a bishop dies or resigns, that does not include the lay people or the priests. There is no longer a democratic component of this. It's no longer an issue of your popularity with the flock. It's only a question of the approval of the civil authority and the recognition of your fellow bishops, right? The church is going to handle this, and never mind those pesky lay people, right? That's one of the things he does. He's also the person who commissions and pays for St. Jerome. Remember, St. Jerome is a guy who takes all these women to go tour the Holy Land and settles in Bethlehem, where he's going to sit in a cave and translate all the scriptures into Latin. Who's paying for that is Damasus, the Pope at that time. He's funding a good part of that venture. Okay, that's what yes, okay. He also, in that bishop succession thing, he also kind of writes it into the process that you have to get the consent of the emperor, because that was something that there was some argument about at one time. You know, maybe we don't care what the emperor thinks, which goes back to the days when the emperor wasn't on our side anyway, right? And the emperor may not have been a Christian. Well, we're now going with the assumption that the emperor is a Christian, and therefore you need to get the emperor's assent when you appoint a new important bishop. Everybody with me so far? Okay. Yes, Ruth, unmute yourself. Are you? Let's see if I can do it. Hang on. I might be able. No, it's not letting me unmute you. I don't know why. Too bad. Did someone else have a question? Did I see another hand? Don't be afraid to unmute yourself and make noise, because I can't, it's a small screen, so I can't always see.
Okay, I think I got it.
Yay!
I wanted to ask you, when in this translation process, what were they translating from and to? Which languages?
Primarily from Greek into Latin. That was what the Roman Church needed, because, and keep in mind that Latin is primarily the language of Rome, and the other churches in the East are more likely to speak Greek. So that's going to become an evolving division between the Western Church in Rome and the other four churches in the East.
Was there not some Aramaic also?
Aramaic, a lot of that translation had already been done.
Okay.
When Jerome was writing, he was taking the small amount of what was in the Gospels or anything like that from Aramaic. That was already been translated into Greek, and the Old Testament as well.
Oh, I was going to say that was from Hebrew then. So all of that had to have been done. All of that.
Well, all of that that's the Septuagint, which is the legend about the 70 scholars who each translated the Old Testament and all came up with exactly the same, so that had already happened. And that was what the Gentile church was using for their text, was primarily Greek until Jerome. Yes, Peggy, or no, yes, it is Peggy.
I also read that he was translating from what they called Old Latin to New Latin. Latin changed a lot too, that he was working with like many different languages.
Right.
Some parts of it were in this language, some had been translated into that, and it was a kind of a mess.
It was.
And even the Old Latin, many of them couldn't read. So it was a combination of.
Right. And, if you think about now how excited we are when we come across some little scrap of manuscript, from that time, these different groups had different copies of different texts. Yes. And it was very confusing and not very authoritative at the time. So you could say, well, our church is reading the letter from Paul to Corinth. Well, which copy of the letter, to Corinth? And maybe the copyist made a mistake or put in his own opinion, or it was really hard to trust that everyone was working from the same text. So that's part of what he's doing as well, is trying to create an authoritative version.
But even today, I remember last fall when we all had different versions of the supposedly the current Bible, but right. We were getting some very different statements that change the meaning depending on the translation.
Right, exactly. So, right, as standardized as things are even today, you can still generate a very interesting conversation, right? And these are people who are trying desperately to say, this and only this is what it means to be a Christian. And, it's impossible in any culture under any circumstances, but that one of the things that was really hard for them was the multiplicity of texts and authorities that they were working with, and having things that were not in the vernacular languages that people actually spoke when they were trying to have these arguments. So that was another thing that Damasus was concerned about. The other early pope is known as Leo the Great. And he is the one who finally, on his own behalf, not the emperor on his behalf, but on his own behalf, he claims the title, the Vicar of Peter. So he claims that he is the person who stands in direct succession from Peter, and therefore he has authority over all other bishops. He's no longer waffling on that. He's making that claim directly in the middle of the 5th century. He also wants to claim, he wants to use Roman inheritance law, and this is an original effort, shall we say, where he considers that the title of the Bishop of Rome or Pope, both used sort of interchangeably at this point, is something that can be inherited. It's like a piece of Roman property. And so with that comes a whole lot of principles of what it means to inherit something, and that there are only certain ways in which that can be challenged. There are only certain limitations that can be placed on what someone inherits from the person who wants to leave it to them. And so his argument is that you don't necessarily need all of these qualifications that even Damasus had kind of said, well, you got to have the emperor's approval and blah, blah, blah. And Leo is like, no, if it is left to you, if it is an inheritance, then you have it, and you have the whole thing, and no one can, no one has the authority to deprive you of it in a meaningful way. So that's kind of a new way of looking at what it is to be a pope or a bishop. He also wants to claim, and this is just before Odoacer is going to completely depose the last Western emperor, but Leo is anticipating that. He's observing the decreasing power of the Western Roman emperor, and he makes the claim that, well, the Roman Empire isn't what it was. You know, it's failing, it's crumbling, and so what we have now, what is intended to exist, the ultimate authority, is going to be what he called the Pax Christianum, or the peace of Christianity, as opposed to the Pax Romanum, which was the principle, you know, for a number of centuries, that a Roman citizen could go anywhere that Rome controlled and be entitled to the same justice and be entitled to the same respect, and to not be bothered or abused or whatever. So, and that all of the territories that were under Roman control were not allowed to go to war with each other, because that was not in Rome's interest, right? So you could fight against Rome, or you could fight against other barbarians if you were a barbarian. But if you were a Roman territory, you could not make war on another Roman territory, right? Everybody see how that works? It would be like the federal government has an interest in Missouri not going to war with Kansas, right? That would not be okay. Now, you know, if you want to go to war with Mexico, that's a different thing politically, right? So Leo, the Pope, is going to propose this idea of the Pax Christianum, that any Christian realm should not be going to war against another Christian realm. The only things that you should be going to war against are to defend your Christian territory from the invasion of unchristian forces, right? And that as a Christian, you were a citizen in a certain way of this Pax Christianum, that that made you the equal of any other Christian anywhere else in the empire, right? Everybody see how that claim works. Okay. So moving to the next page, then you have the Council of Chalcedon in 451, again, just before the final end, if you will, of the Western Empire, which is attended largely by Eastern Byzantine bishops. That the Pope of Rome, or the Bishop of Rome, kind of stops going to a lot of these councils that are called among the Eastern cities, because he thinks he's in charge anyway. He doesn't see why he should have to go and be treated as an equal to these other guys. So he doesn't go. But one important thing that happens at that council, they did a lot of theological stuff, which is kind of mind-numbing unless you're really a geek for it. And if you really want to do geek theology sometime, I'm happy to indulge that. But it would bore the socks off of you at the moment, arguing about, the nature of Christ and those kinds of things. But one of the side issues that they deal with is the challenge of the authority of monks and abbots. And remember that the monastics were kind of a subsidiary, almost an independent development from the hierarchical church, from the bishops and the, well, they're not cathedrals yet, but the seats of the bishops and the way in which they are interconnected as the power structure of the church. Anybody can kind of go out and start an abbey. Anybody can go move into a cave and become a desert father and come to be regarded as holy, right? Come to be regarded as a spiritual authority to lay people. And that's kind of a dangerous thing, because you never know what those guys are going to be teaching. And especially when they start challenging the institutional power structure of the church as potentially corrupt, and they start saying, these guys are in league with the civil authority, with the emperor, with the army. They're really not following religious principles. And those are not necessarily the teachings of Jesus, but they are sort of recognized characteristics of holy people, like not being greedy and not amassing a lot of money, and probably being celibate and not living a luxurious or indulgent lifestyle, and all of those kinds of things. Well, a lot of the institutional church leaders were doing all that stuff. And so the monastics were in a position to challenge that, and reject what the bishops told them, and reject what the church authorities told them on the basis of kind of contempt for their lifestyle and their their institutional power, shall we say. So what happens at Chalcedon is that the council decides, the council of bishops decides, that monks and abbots are to be subject to the local bishop. So the local bishop is the one that has authority, and they can direct what happens in the monasteries and who gets to be in charge of the monasteries and what the monasteries are going to teach and sort of promulgate as their vision of Christianity. If they want to be poor, that's fine. If they want to be celibate, that's fine. But they're going to have the orthodox ideas about Jesus and about God. They have to line up with what is being decided by the institutional and intellectual church about what Christianity is. So, and that is going to become an increasingly significant decision, especially in the West, as monasticism becomes more and more powerful as a force within the church. Everybody get the implications of that? Okay. So the leadership vacuum in Rome that the bishop stepped into, which kind of allowed him to become then more than just an ordinary bishop in Rome, is intensified, of course, in 467 when Odoacer takes the empire, the imperial insignia, the crown and the scepter and the robe and all that stuff, and FedExes it back to Constantinople and says, here, you guys have this stuff because nobody in the West is qualified anymore. And so he doesn't treat it with disrespect, and therefore, which was very clever of him, very provident, because he does not arouse the antipathy of the Eastern emperor. It's more sort of saying, you know, here, for whatever it's worth, it's all yours, you know. But by the way, I'm a barbarian and I'm in control now, so it may not be worth all that much. But he doesn't do it with scorn, you know. He doesn't do it with contempt. He does it with, you know, let's just, you know, everybody be cool. You know, it's going to be fine. But what that means is there's no longer even an ostensible emperor in the West. And the other four major bishoprics or sees are in the East, and they are accountable to the Eastern emperor who is still there. But at this point, the Bishop of Rome, or the Pope, has almost no competition for any kind of authority in Rome. And the barbarians do not make Rome their headquarters. So there's not even, the barbarian kings are not even local to Rome. So there is no longer a unified civil power in the West. So you start to get the rise of the European kings. For instance, Clovis, who understands himself to be the king of the Franks, which is the tribes in what we now refer to as France. He is born in 466, just 1 year before Odoacer deposes the last emperor. He converts to Christianity. He's a general. He's fighting in the military on behalf of the Franks. And at the point of a particularly crucial battle, he has a sort of Constantinian experience, if you will, where he converts to Christianity in the hopes that this will help him win the battle, which he does. And at that point, he begins a competition with the church authorities for who's in charge of whom. Is it the church authorities that recognize him as king, or is it he who recognizes the church authorities as pope? And he has him at his he has this event, which is a combination, a cross between a baptism and a coronation. So that at the same moment he formally becomes a Christian. And remember, all these guys are used to becoming Christians and then waiting to be baptized until the end of their life, or until it's convenient or whatever. But so he's going to combine this with his coronation. So as was traditional at a baptism, he was anointed with oil by the bishop. But this also becomes part of the coronation ritual. So there is this, what the church will come to claim and understand is that the church has the right to anoint a king, and that until a king is anointed by the church, they are not the representative of God on earth. They're not the divine right of kings only applies if you've been anointed in the same way. Does that make sense? So it's kind of a ritual balance of power moment. You know, who gets to ratify whose decision about who's going to be in charge. Okay. Clovis has an interesting have his cake and eat it too theory, which is that he is going to ally with the Roman Church. The Roman Church are the people he has to deal with right here and now in the West, those bishops. Those are the folks who can help him or hurt him. On the other hand, there is no civil or military authority in the West. And so he's going to ally with Constantinople on those levels, so that he's going to have a diplomatic relationship, shall we say, with the Byzantine military and secular power, but not with the Byzantine church. And so that's part of how he maintains his power at that time, is to be able to say yes to the Western Roman Church, but he can function as the Western Roman civil authority because there basically isn't one. And so that from that point of view, he can then have a relationship with the Byzantine civil authority as kind of a country to country kind of diplomatic relationship. Does that make sense? So even though the Roman Church is not in accord with or not in a good relationship with the Byzantine Church, Clovis can still have that relationship with the Byzantine Emperor while he does his own thing with the Christian Church where he is. Everybody good? Okay, good. We might actually do this. So then for the next about 44, almost 50 years, you have what is known in history as the Osteogothic Papacy. And what that means is that the kings in the West are the kings from the barbarian tribes. They're the successors of Odoacer, including Theodoric, who is the person who, and they tend to succeed by assassinating each other. I mean, it's not usually a peaceful transition of power. So Theodoric, in 493, assassinates Odoacer and succeeds him. Now, Theodoric is an interesting character. He's an Arian Christian, and he was raised in Constantinople as a hostage. He was a hostage for the good behavior of his tribe. It was something that often happened in diplomatic relationships. If you were worried about another nation attacking you, you had them send, the king's son or some important nobleman or whatever, who would be living under the control of one power. And the understanding was that if the other power did something that they had agreed not to do, it would not end well for that kid or that person who was living in the other realm as a hostage. But what that meant was that Theodoric grew up in the culture of Constantinople. So he was not a barbarian in the sense of education, but he was in the sense of heritage. And so when he becomes an adult, he becomes the leader of his tribe, of the Ostrogoths. But he still has the culture. Okay, Kat. Now she wants to play with my notes. He still has the culture of the Eastern Empire. And he is an Arian. So his early reign, he's sort of like, I'm an Ostrogoth. I'm not a Roman. I am a Christian, but I'm an Eastern Christian. I'm an Arian. So you guys in the Roman Catholic Western Church, you do your thing. That's fine. I'm just going to run things politically. And he was fairly tolerant religiously, much more so than the Roman Church itself was at that point. But interestingly, both the Byzantines and the Romans looked down on him. They regarded him as a heretic and an interloper. So the Byzantines regarded him as a barbarian, necessarily. The Romans regarded him as an Arian, which made him a heretic. And everybody thought that, given the fact that he was of barbarian extraction, he wasn't an old Roman family. He really wasn't entitled to be in a position of leadership. He was, one of the interesting things about Theodoric is he was the person who sponsored the work of Boethius. And Boethius is a philosopher figure, an intellectual academic, who did a lot of work trying to reconcile Greek and Roman philosophy with Christian doctrine. He's sort of anticipates the scholastic tradition of the High Middle Ages. And he also was something of a diplomat and tried to mediate between the West and the Byzantine emperor, and to keep the peace, because that was what Theodoric wanted, was to keep the peace. Later, Theodoric begins to observe, believe that Arians are being persecuted in the East. And because of that, he begins to persecute the Roman Catholics, the Trinitarians in the West. In other words, my people are being persecuted over there in Constantinople. I'm going to persecute the Orthodox Christians here in my territory. And ultimately, he comes to believe that Boethius is part of a plot against his life. Whether he was or not remains a subject of historical dispute. But anyway, ultimately, Theodoric has Boethius executed. But Boethius remains this really significant bridge figure between the intellectual and academic traditions of Greece and Rome and what will become the intellectual academic traditions of the Christendom, the Christian culture of Western Europe. It makes sense. And because that became possible because he was serving during this Osteogothic Papacy, when the allegedly Christian but culturally barbarian kings were in charge of what was happening in Western Europe. Theodoric has a couple of successors, Athalaric and Theohodad, whose name I love, they were not as interested in what the church was doing. They weren't patronizing philosophers, although both of them were also Arians. So you see this Arian influence continues through the power structure of Western Europe. And this is going to make the church, the hierarchical church, very anxious. They're always going, it's like communism in the US, they're going to see Arians under the bed forever, and we were there. So it's not that they're wrong about that, because that tradition is going to continue. But there were several, I think, culturally interesting divisions between the barbarian rulers and the Roman culture that they were trying to administer. One, of course, is the language. So the Romans were speaking Latin, and the kings and their courts and administrators were speaking Gothic. So there was a miss of communication there between the rulers and the common people, that the kings never really adopted Latin as a mode of communication. There was a significant difference in clothing. Ouch, cat. you want to say hi? There she is. See? Yes. Bye, Abby.
Kendall,
Yes.
would you clarify for me? Everybody else probably knows, but what are you calling Gothic? What is that?
The Goths were a group of tribes in Northern Europe. So you have the Ostrogoths, who were the eastern tribes, and the Visigoths, who were the western tribes. And that was just their tribal name. We'll come to use it for other things, but it was also a language that they spoke. Does that help?
So they were wandering tribes, kind of? Or?
They were more nomadic than the Roman Empire was, certainly. But they had established territories, basically north of the Danube was where anybody north of the Danube was a barbarian. And you had the Goths, you had the Vandals. There's a whole, I mean, again, it's tedious and boring unless you're really fascinated by it. But the barbarian cultures, it wasn't just a single thing, really occupied the northern half of Europe, and the
So you're saying barbarians and Goths are sort of
the Goths are an instance of barbarians. The Goths are among the barbarian tribes, among who else were the Vandals and the Huns, and there are several other groups in that. But barbarian comes from the Latins making fun of the way they spoke. So anybody who didn't speak Latin just sounded like they were saying bar, 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 bar. And so they called them barbarians, people who can't speak.
Written?
Sorry?
Written language or dialects or?
Many of the barbarians did not have written language. That was one of the things. Remember Ophilas, who went off to evangelize? One of the things that he did was to create a written language for the tribes that he was working with, the Germanic tribes. So I would say, who knows? I'm sure there's an exception in there somewhere, but in general, no, the barbarian tribes did not have written languages. But as they became exposed to Christianity, they often adopted Latin or developed their own written languages.
It was the Greeks. Barbaros is a Greek
word. Oh, sorry, Greeks.
And
okay.
In fact, the Romans were the barbarians.
The initial ones.
The Greeks. Right.
Yes.
Anyone who didn't speak Greek was uncivilized.
Right.
And so by the time of the Romans, the word just simply meant something else.
Right. Thank you. Yes. But originally it's a catch-all term for anyone who doesn't talk like us. So it didn't mean a particular location necessarily or anything about the group other than that it didn't speak good Greek and then eventually good Latin. So does that, and Gothic is going to become, an architectural style and eventually a fashion statement. And there are all kinds of things that we use the word Gothic for at this point, but originally it just referred to those northern tribes. Oh yeah, the culture. Yeah, so
on your dress.
Yeah, and right in addition to the language, there was this major clothing thing where the warmer Mediterranean climates, people tended to dress lightly, and that was traditionally in togas. And there were all kinds of ways of that your toga could demonstrate your class and your level of authority and your wealth and all these different kinds of things. The barbarians tended to dress in outfits that basically had pants because they came from colder climates, and they tended to dress in hides rather than in woven cloth. So there was a particular kind of differentiation that you could kind of always tell what someone's background was based on what they preferred to wear. And this was also true, interestingly, it had to do with food as well, that If you were from a Mediterranean culture, you primarily tended to fry and season your food with plant oil, with olive oil or other vegetable oils. If you were from a northern culture, you tended to use lard, you tended to use animal fat. And so the two groups both thought they could smell each other because it contributed to a particular kind of body odor, depending on which form of fat you were using. So it wasn't just a matter of, do I want to eat with them? It was a matter of, they smell funny. You know, they're not nice to be around because of this difference in diet, basically. Also, they had different legal systems. And this was an issue because the Roman citizens who harked back to the Roman Empire thought that they should be judged by Roman laws, that was the correct legal procedure. And of course, the tribal people coming in had tribal laws that they administered justice by. And it's not that one was more logical or merciful or justice making than the other, it's just that they were different. And so there was a period of time throughout the Osteogothic Papacy, certainly, when, depending on whether you were a descendant of the tribal people or a descendant of the Roman people, determined which set of laws you got judged by. And basically each group had its courts. And so there was, of course, always conflict depending on whose judgment someone was subjected to and whether they thought it was fair, and you know, who was going to administer it and so on. But there was this parallel legal system for quite a number of years because neither group felt that the others was adequate or represented fundamentally what they understood as justice. And then the other cultural shift that's going to happen, and we'll look coming up at the climate changes and the demographic changes that contribute to this, but when you don't have a centralized authority, it's very difficult to maintain an urban culture. And so Western Europe at this time is becoming less and less concentratedly urban and more agricultural, where wealth consists of land. And so it's the large landed estates that constitute the source of power and the source of authority and the source of wealth. And this contributes to the rise of feudalism in the West, whereas the Eastern culture is going to continue to be very urban, right down through the Ottoman Empire. So the West is basically going to lose a money economy, which never happens in the East. And once you have an economy that's primarily barter, that's primarily agricultural, it becomes much harder to fund a central bureaucracy. You know, if someone's bringing you grain to pay their taxes, you got to store it and you got to figure out how to use it before it goes bad. And it's not nearly as neat as having them bring you gold bars or silver coins or whatever the money economy idea of identifying wealth is. And it's also very hard to pay mercenaries because, again, if you're a soldier marching around, you don't want to have to carry several barrels of oil as your paycheck, right? You want coins. And so the East becomes much more adept at using mercenary armies than the West will be for a period of time. And finally, the local churches and monasteries become dependent on local support. It's harder for a centralized authority to enforce their decisions on an institution that doesn't need anything from them that they can't really do much for. And so again, you can maybe send somebody some resources, but it's hard to send them something that they can then turn into whatever they want to turn it into. So that makes it a decentralized kind of power structure. And this leads to the church, which is the one centralized structure that kind of still exists, to taking over a number of functions of this, what would have been a central civil government. And that includes education, and it also includes diplomacy. So at this point, a number of the popes and bishops are going to become negotiators, but for both military actions and for international relations, that they're the ones that go to the invading army and say, please don't sack the city. What can we give you that will keep you from destroying us or burning us out? Or, counseling with the kings who are about to attack each other and saying, you're going to lose people and you're going to lose people, and how, what do you need? How can we work this out? That became something that church officials were regarded as empowered to do, because there was no other authority that could do it with an equal claim. So that's perfect timing. Questions or anything that you want? Do you all see how this is helping the popes acquire more and more authority and more resources in this kind of dispersed and chaotic environment? And next time we'll see a little bit about the Lombards and how they're going to now come in and break up Italy even further into smaller administrative groups. No questions? Okay. All right, then everybody stay warm, and we'll see you next week.